Hello everybody and welcome to the Wine with Jimmy channel. Delighted to have you on board. This is a video all about explaining wine terminology, and we're going to go through some rather scientific wine aroma compounds in order to give you the understanding for why certain aromas exist in wine. So this is getting rather scientific and a little bit geeky, but all for the greater understanding of the world of wine. If you have a comment or a question, please do get in touch. Potentially you have something to say about one of these aroma compounds. Perhaps you like them, you don't like them, and maybe you have some other examples of wines you might find them in. Please do get in touch. Make sure you click like and subscribe. So let's rock and roll talking about key wine aroma compounds to begin with. So I'm going to put up a little chart here to begin with. So the aromas in wine have been subject of rather intense scientific research in recent years. It's a real complex scientific field due to the sheer number of compounds that are involved, and especially due to the final aroma of wine being a product of the interaction between aromatic and non-aromatic compounds in wine. This complexity here is actually depicted in the diagram of Vincent Ferrara's model for wine aromas. You'll see that's actually listed at the top. So this is talking through, in yellow there, the impact aromas. So really specific aromas which can be identified. So things like Rotundone, for example, which is the peppery compound that one finds in things like pepper, juniper, cloves, and so on. And we find it in wine in like Syrah, for example, and Gruner Veltliner. Things like the 4-MMP Thiol, which is a box tree aroma in Sauvignon Blanc, for example. We then have the non-volatile wine matrix. So these may affect the way the aromatic compounds are sensed. We'll go through that a little bit later. The contributory aromas, so these are below the normal individual perception threshold, but when combined with others, may actually impact the wine's style. So for example, ethyl acetate is very fruity at low levels, and things like vanillin as well, when, of course, oak comes into play. And then we've got the common one, the common compounds all to wine. So there are hundreds of these produced by the act of fermentation. So e.g. ethanol, as it says here, higher alcohols, some acids like acetic, for example, as well. So you've got compounds which may be sweet, pungent, maybe fruity. We'll talk through some of these as well. We're going to group them into four sources of aromas. So we talked about wine coming from aromatic and non-aromatic compounds. Its aromatic complexity arises from the presence of these molecules and from their interaction with each other. So we're going to talk about where aromas will come from the grapes themselves. We'll talk about aromas created by fermentation due to the presence of aroma precursors. So they don't necessarily smell or taste anything at that moment in time as a fruit or as a must, but through fermentation will actually create an aroma compound. Aromas originating from fermentation and its byproducts, volatile sulfur compounds, for example, and then aroma from other sources, things like smoke, so guacol, things like vanillin, for example, from wood, and so on. So we'll go through those as well. So let's talk about aromas from the grapes. So examples of aromatic compounds that are found in the grapes include Methoxypyrazines and Rotundone, for example. So let's go through methoxypyrazine to begin with. Now, methoxypyrazines, sometimes just called pyrazines, occur in the Sauvignon Blanc grape variety to give that sort of green pepper, asparagus, grassy, tomato leafy character. But you will also find it in things like Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, which are all related to Sauvignon Blanc, amongst others as well. So, what are these methoxypyrazines? Well, they are thought to be what is produced by fruit and by the plant in order to act as an antecedent, a little bit similar to tannin. So, in nature, it is being produced to protect the plant and then the fruit through its adolescent stage. So it's protecting a little bit like a parent would protect the children, for example. So methoxypyrazine levels gradually increase in grapes as the berries grow. Okay, so from flowering fruit set and through to the growth of the berry, it reaches a maximum level around veraison. Okay, and this is along potentially with tannin as well. And then, as ripeness starts to increase towards the end of the season, methoxypyrazine will begin to decrease. So, therefore, you can make the assumption that underripe berries, potentially from a colder place where the climate and the weather has not been it's not been playing ball, it's not been great, or potentially it's being picked early on purpose for higher methoxypyrazine levels. So that is interesting because these compounds, of course, are what we would find to be fairly grassy and green peppery, as you'll see there, and asparagus in your picture. Another one from the grapes is one which is very evident when you taste a grape that has a level of this, and this is Rotundone. Rotundone is a chemical compound called a sesquiterpene. And a sesquiterpene, the Rotundone, it occurs in varieties like Syrah and varieties like Mondeuse, for example, Grüner Veltliner as well. In Grüner Veltliner, it's like a white pepper character. In Syrah, it's a mixture, white pepper, black pepper, clove, and licorice. And Rotundone originates on the grape skins, and in fact, it's one of the few aromatic compounds which can be found directly both in the grapes and in the resulting wine. It's a compound I'm very keen on in wine. I love Grüner Veltliner, and I'm very much obsessed with Syrah or Shiraz as well from cooler areas. The relationship of Rotundone is that it does actually exhibit greater amounts in ripe but cooler conditions. The Australian Wine Research Institute has done a fantastic amount of studies that has shown that in warmer locations, where it really gets warm to hot, Shiraz will exhibit less Rotundone when it is made into a wine compared to cooler places that you might find, say, in the Clare Valley or somewhere like Grampians, where in Australia, where you find cooler conditions and a more protected nature of Rotundone. Fascinating. And of course, this translates into the Northern Rhone and also in New Zealand, Hawke's Bay, where conditions are cooler, and you will find a protected amount of that Rotundone characteristic. Now we move on to aromas that are created by fermentation due to the presence of aroma precursors in grape must. So aroma precursors are compounds that are not in themselves aromatic, but are building blocks which become aromatic during fermentation. For example, many compounds occur in grapes in a form combined with sugar become aromaless precursors. However, through the process of fermentation, they become aromatic. So, what about these? Thiols. Okay, you'll see a table here that shows you these. Thiols are a category of aromatic compounds which are released during fermentation. It's also known as a mercaptan. These thiols are sulfur-containing organic compounds with a sulfur atom bound to a hydrogen atom, and that creates the SH group, sulfhydryl or thiol group. Sulfur-containing volatile compounds are often very aromatic. There are a whole group of them that in wine will contribute fruity aromas such as blackcurrant, grapefruit, guava, and passion fruit. You'll see the top two here on your thiols, 3MH and 3MHA. And they also play a role in the aromas of other foods and drinks, such as roasted coffee, popcorn, grilled meat, and even beer. Sauvignon Blanc has three thiols that you'll see up here that are important in its varietal aroma. So that is the thiols on the left-hand side, the sensory characteristic for what we will get as humans. 3MH gives you grapefruit, passion fruit. 3MHA, sweet, sweaty passion fruit. 4MMP, cat's pee. That broomy sort of cat's pee character, which many people do relate to. And the perception threshold in wine, you'll see that for 3MH it's 60, and this is micrograms per litre, 0.8 for cat's pee, hence why many people get it, and then 3MHA is 4. And the concentration found in an example here, like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, the perception of all of these is above the threshold, and that's why we find a combination of these components in many New Zealand or Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, for example. Keep on going, we've got terpenes. These are another category of compounds that are formed in the same way, so fermentation of wine. They are widely found in wines giving fruity and floral aromas. The examples here are what we got, so things like linalool, geraniol, and citronellol. And the geraniol and linalool often give you the kind of grapey, muscatty character in muscat grapes. So let's talk about geraniol first of all. This terpene gives white wines in particular its rose-like character, which you might find in the likes of Gewürztraminer and Torrontés. Geraniol is found in bound grapes that have passed through fermentation process, as we would expect. Some white wine varietals will have higher levels, as I mentioned, and that's due to combination of things like the region, terroir, and also human influence fermentation process. Linalool. So if you catch a little bit of a smell of, say, lavender, potentially, or maybe even violet, this is the linalool that is present in the grape. You might notice this on red varietals, for example, like things like Syrah, also things like Gamay, but also you might notice it on some Chenin Blancs and Muscat, which can typically have a high content of both of these. So yeah, and also linked to these, orange blossom, lily, bay leaves, for example, as well. Citronellol is the citrusy aroma in wines like Riesling, Chenin, Chardonnay, and even sort of fresher Viognier, something you might be fairly used to. So what about aromas originating from fermentation and its byproducts? So some aromas do not originate from the grapes, but are created from fermentation and its byproduct, such as lees. Esters are compounds which are formed by the reaction of certain acids and alcohols. The majority are created through the action of yeasts in the fermentation process. So esters are responsible for many fresh and fruity aromas, and therefore are essential in the aroma profile of young wines. And there are hundreds of these. They're very important in the aromas of white wines, young white wines, for example. And many examples there, like your stone fruit group, your tropical fruit, your citric fruit, your green fruit, your red fruits, your black fruits, and the list goes on. We're going to take one of these here. One of the most common esters is isomal acetate, which gives aromas of banana when the concentration is very high, but others will produce apple, pineapple, and many other compounds. Now, isomal acetate, also known as pear oil or banana oil, is a characteristic of cool fermented white and red wines which have undergone the process of carbonic maceration. So examples here include things like Beaujolais Nouveau. Another common ester is ethyl acetate. That's when acetic acid reacts with the alcohol in the wine and becomes ethyl acetate, the characteristic you find in nail varnish remover. Most esters are unstable, but they will break down a few months after fermentation, interestingly. So some of these will become a part of the wine. Some of them may actually blow off after the fermentation. And you may have been into a winery and experienced this as the wine is pumping along through its fermentation. There are lots of fruity compounds coming out along with the carbon dioxide. It's a little bit unusual. Some of them remain, some of them blow off through the fermentation stage, as long as the fermentation is happy. Another one is acetaldehyde. This occurs in wines due to the oxidation of ethanol, so the oxidation of our alcohol. It's a small and highly reactive molecule with a green grass, apple-like, and almondy nutty aroma. It kind of dominates fresh fruit, so it goes over fresh fruit and has a bit of a stale smell that is regarded as a bit of a fault in some wines. However, it is important in a style like Fino or Manzanilla sherry. At low levels, acetaldehyde can contribute pleasant fruity aromas to a wine, yes. However, at higher levels, it's considered a defect and it's reminiscent of kind of bruised to rotten apples. The threshold in wine is around 100 to 125 micrograms per litre. Something like a Fino sherry will be around 180. But along with the kind of power of the alcohol and the spirit that is added, these compounds can be actually a positive to some people, of course. Further byproducts, so diacetyl. Diacetyl is produced during fermentation and especially with malolactic conversion. It smells of melted butter and it can also come across as creaminess in wine, as well as things like popcorn and butterscotch. Diacetyl also happens to be used by the food industry to make margarine taste more buttery. Can't believe it's not butter. And that's because diacetyl is the dominant aromatic molecule found in butter itself. So, it's found through malolactic conversion. That's where bacteria transforms sharp malic acid into much softer lactic acid. This is why Chardonnays will often be buttery and creamy. When Chardonnay goes through malolactic, aged in new American oak, which imparts vanilla and nuttiness, that's when the popcorn or butterscotch comes in, which can be often a little bit too much for some people. Certainly, we found that on a lot of Chardonnays around the millennia change, around 2000. What else have we got? Well, in certain conditions, yeast, which is carrying out the fermentation, can produce what we call volatile sulfur compounds or reductive sulfur compounds during the fermentation and the lees aging. Now, this could be due to the certain type of yeast used, or that the yeast is placed under stress. It's not in its happiest environment, potentially because there is a lack of nutrients, for example, or temperature conditions are not okay. The common one is the lack of nitrogen causing the yeast to release H2S, hydrogen sulfide, which can combine with other wine components to create volatile sulfur compounds. The low nitrogen availability can be fixed by a winery by adding basically junk food for yeast, something called diammonium phosphate, DAP. And this kind of makes the yeast happier in the short term to create the fermentation. Now, depending on the type of compounds present in the wine and their levels of concentration, The aromas through these volatile sulfur compounds can be from struck match, which may be desirable, to rotten eggs, which would be regarded as a fault. You'll see some here. So hydrogen sulfate, if the fermentation has gone through a problem, you might get sort of rotten eggs, rotten fruit, sewage, for example. Mercaptans, known as thiols, these, if they combine with VSEs, can get very smelly in their sulfur. Cabbage, rubbery, burnt rubber also. Ethyl mercaptan, that can be more burnt match, sulfur and earthy. And methyl mercaptan, this could be rotten cabbage, cooked cabbage, burnt rubber, stagnant water. So many of these are non-positive and generally stem from a negative yeast fermentation where it's gone through too much stress. But there needs to be something mentioned here at this time about minerality. So this is my little note on minerality, one of the most overused terminologies in wine sensory analysis. You'll typically hear critics and wine enthusiasts mentioning that the wine is minerally or it has wet stones and things like that. So first of all, I want to clearly outline that it's not possible to have a direct transfer of a mineral aroma compound from geology, the soil, to the wine. It's not possible. These mineral compounds are in fact odorless and flavorless. I do want to mention, though, that geological conditions, so the soil and the conditions of the soil, they may have an indirect effect on the perception of minerality when we come to enjoy the wine. And what I mean by that is that the different compounds of the acid nature, the pH, the drainage, the water, the nutrient uptake, all of these things may have an impact on the wine's characteristics, such as acidity, which may create a sensory shift in the wine. And what I mean by that is that you might start to sense with higher acid levels, for example, if you have a very alkaline-based soil like limestone and chalk, you get higher acidity and the wine starts to seem a little bit more salty or fresher, which we might associate with minerality. Okay, so please get it in your mind that minerality is not directly related, it's more indirect with geology. And studies have shown that volatile sulfur compounds, that we talked about on the last slide, can actually produce positive reductive aromas in wine. So if you are aging a wine on gross lees, and there's a big glass full of winey lees there, if you're aging a wine on static, non-stirred gross lees, they will release sulfur compounds into the wine, which will give an aroma compound which is often considered struck match, minerally, flinty, for example. This is very evident on many Chardonnays and Chenin Blanc around the world that have been aged on gross lees. As a winemaker, I do this. I do this on my Chardonnay to add that reductive, what I call reductive minerality to the wine. Other compounds. So there are numerous other sources of aroma compounds found in wine. We're just going to name a couple of common ones. Vanillin, which gives aroma of course, vanilla, is just one of those, and it may come from certain types of new oak barrels, with some areas in the world having higher levels of vanillin in their oak, such as the United States. There's also octalactone as well. This is a lactone compound which comes from aging in oak too, which can give you a lactone-y, a kind of coconutty characteristic to the wine. Consider the coconuts, for example. That is a Disney link, if anybody gets it. There's a couple of others here as well to mention. Eucalyptol, which can be volatilized from eucalyptus trees by heat, and it's absorbed by the bloomy, waxy layer on top of the skins, and then, of course, added into the wine through the process of crushing and pressing and fermenting. And then also, there is the famous petrol or kerosene smell in Riesling. This is known as TDN, 1,16-trimethyl-1,2-dihydronaphthalene. Now, you know why that's abbreviated to TDN. It's difficult to say. And this relates to sun exposure of grape skins. So classically linked with Riesling. Riesling will have high levels of this TDN, which then gives higher levels of petrol and kerosene and oiliness, and that is through sun exposure. It's also increased by things like more oxidation, more aging, more maturity in bottle, for example. So you'll find it on older Rieslings, as well as Rieslings that are in sunny conditions, maybe somewhere like low latitude Australia, in places like Eden and Clare, for example. There's also a mention of phenols as well, derived from oak agents. There's guaiacol, which gives smoky, toasted, and roasted notes found from oak, but you might also get that from smoke taint, for example, as a fault. And then eugenol as well, which is famous for the clovey character one finds in wine as well. So there you are, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for listening along on the wine aroma compounds here, with some of the science behind it. I do hope you find this very useful for your studies and to link some of those compounds in place. If you do have any questions or comments, please do leave the comment and question below. Make sure you click like and subscribe. And if you find yourself in the UK, come and say hi for a class, glass, or bottle, or specifically a bottle of Bear Green Winery wine. I've been Jimmy Smith. Ciao for now. Goodbye.